Today is Sunday and it's Chof Gimel Shvat. We're having Parsha class. Now this week, of course, is Parshas Mishpatim. Parshas Mishpatim is a chock full of mitzvahs. It's the first really packed Parsha. You know, that means Parshas Boy probably had a dozen mitzvahs. But Parshas Mishpatim, I don't know how many it has, 30 or 40, that's a lot. And it's very distinctive. It's distinctive because the mitzvahs in Parshas Mishpatim go into a very unique category. It's not just random, arbitrary mitzvahs, a little of this, a little of this, a little of that. The whole Chayshah Mishpat is in Parshas Mishpatim. All business law is in Parshas Mishpatim. Now, it's not the only place in the Torah you have Chayshah Mishpat. You have in Parshas Bahar, you have some more business law. And I'm certain that in Sefer Dvarim and a number of parshas you have other inyanim that also discuss about, you know, the practical side of business. But Parshas Mishpatim is a very distinctive parsha because it deals with very, very practical things. To use a Talmudic term, a Gemara term, the discussion of Parshas Mishpatim is called Nizikin. For those who are not aware, in the Shas, there are three Masechtas that are called Bava. The first grandmother, the second grandmother, and the third grandmother. Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, and Baba Basra. They once asked the Baruch Mezhebezer if he knows what Baba Kama is. He says, yeah, Baba Kama is Baruch ben Adel Kodesh Merechem Imei. Baruch, the son of Adel, is holy from his mother's womb. The Baruch Mezhebezer. Anyway, the understanding is that Baba Kama, Baba Metzia, and Baba Basra are really one Masechta. They're one tractate. But that it's so large that it would be totally overwhelming. So Rabbi Yehuda Anasi did us a favor and divided this one tractate into three parts. So Bava actually means section or stanza. Bava means stanza 1, stanza 2, and stanza 3. So Bava Kama is not the name of a Masechta, it's the name of a section. So what is the name of this collective Masechta which is called Bava Kama, Bava Metzia, Bava Basra? And the answer is it's called Masechta Nizikin. Just like you have Seder Taras and Masechta Taras, you have Seder Nizikin and Meseches Nizikin. Nizikin doesn't only mean damages. Nizikin means liability. That's the English translation of the word, liabilities. Which means it's a general term that alludes to all kinds of relationships with people that have to do with business. In some cases have to do with personal things as well, like violence and damaging of property and so forth. All of it is discussed in Masechta Nizikin. And the place for it in the Torah is Parshas Mishpatim. Parshas Mishpatim. And of course the Torah begins with Ve'ela Mishpatim Asher Tasim Lefneim. If you thought that for something to be Torah, it must be holy and esoteric and lofty, you're wrong. Ve'ela vav meisav alin rishin, that the practical day-to-day laws that govern the civil relationships between one person and the next, that have to do with people not lying to each other and not cheating each other, and how to resolve disputes when there are misunderstandings, and how to resolve disputes when there are uncertainties, and how to resolve disputes when there is a loss of money, or there is a situation where every minute more money is being lost because of a division between two people. Parshas Mishpatim, which deals with such down-to-earth things, they are as much Misinai as Liyilach Elokim Acherim Alponai. They need to worship one God. So Parshas Mishpatim is quite a leap from Parshas Yisrei, the 10 Commandments that speak about the Dvarim Ha'im Deberum Shaleilim, the most lofty things in the world. At least the first 5 do. And Parshas Mishpatim deals with very down-to-earth practical matter. And this too is from Sinai. However, it's not all of the Parshas Mishpatim that deals with what we would call Nizikin. It's not the totality of Parshas Mishpatim that deals with what I'm translating in English as liabilities, different obligations that exist between people. It's still about Chamishi or Shishi. It's not mamish the end. Near the end of the Parsha, there are other things that come up. For example, near the end of the Parsha, the Torah discusses the Yomim Tovim. That means to say, Pesach, Shua, Sukkot. It's very, very brief, but you have the Yomim Tovim. For those who are not aware, the Yomim Tovim are mentioned in the Chumash 5 times. Twice in Sefer Shmois, once in Mishpatim and once in Pashas Kisisa and Kesef Talva, once in Vayikir and Pashas Emer, once in Bamidbar and Pashas Pinchas, and once in Dvarim and Pashas Re'eh. And in Pashas Dvarim there's two allusions to the Yomim Tevim, a very brief one in our Pasha and a much more elaborate one in Pashas Kisisa. So you talk about the Yom Tif, and then you have two more discussions. Two more discussions. In other words, after you finish all of these Nizikin, all of these issues that deal with very practical monetary issues in people's lives, and mostly the relationships between people, partnerships, neighbors, borrowing, lending, looking after people's property, damages, and so forth and so on, there are two more discussions. Number one, there's a discussion about the future of the Jewish nation. I'm going to get back to this momentarily. And number two, we go back to the story of the giving of the Torah. Ve'almeisha Amar Alei. Kapitel Chavdalet begins, Ve'almeisha Amar Alei. And Kapitel Chavdalet has 18 Possuk. Now I don't want to get into the Machlekes Rambam and Ramban because it's too much of a distraction and time is always of premium. But the Pasha finishes off with a whole discussion about other details of the story that surrounded the events leading up to, during, and following the story of the actual giving of the Torah. That's from, I don't know, from Shvi or from, I guess, yeah, it's in the middle of Shvi. It's a pretty long aliyah. The thing that we do want to slow down about, which is the topic of tonight's class, is that after we finish all the halachas of Nezikin, and we mention Yom Tov, we start to talk about the fact that the Yidden are going to go into Eretz Yisrael. There's a mention made of the fact that they're going to go into Eretz Yisrael with a malach, that Hashem is not going to take them in. And the mention of the fact that Hashem is going to wipe out the various nations. And you have the first of many warnings. Do not leave a trace of the pagan past. Destroy it, obliterate it. I have an uncle who's an ancient historian, who says the Jews did a good job. When they study now, they have a historical record of Israel based on the archaeological finds. They can find all the idols that existed before the Yidden came, and all the idols that the Yidden themselves created. But the idols that the Yidden found when they came into the land, they pulverized and destroyed. This is a historian. He's not speaking as a chassid. The Yidden haben chorb gemacht. They didn't leave a trace. They destroyed every single idol that they found in Eretz Yisrael as the Eibishter commanded. Because the Eibishter did not want, God forbid, that they should learn from the pagan ways of the people who came there before them. Okay? And in that scheme, you have an interesting message. The message amounts to basically, you be good, I be good. And you not be good, it won't be so good. That's what the message amounts to. You understand that much Brooklynese you can relate to. Yeah, right? But it's these two psukim which are the focus of tonight's class. Okay, let me repeat myself. The bulk of the parsha deals with what's called nizikin. That means relations between people and matters of business. There's a small mention of Yom Tov. That's till Shishi. The end of the Pasha is going to continue the story of Matan Torah. Events that happened, according to Rashi, at least on Hey Sivan, on Vav Sivan, and on Zayin Sivan. In between, you can have a handful of psukim, I think it's 10 psukim, which is going to be the first of many references to how the Jewish people should behave when they have the great merit of going into the Holy Land. And one of the things that's mentioned in that scheme is that if we will serve the Eibishter will be good to us. And if chas v'shalom we don't, Hashem is not going to be so good to us in kind. And we're going to read these two psukim. It's the last Possuk of Shishi and the first Possuk of Shvi. It's on page 1. It says, Va'avadtem es Hashem Elokeichem. You should serve God who is your God. Uveirach es lachmucha v'esmeimecha. So you should bless your bread and water. That means your food. V'hasirei simach lemikirbecha. And I'm going to remove all illness from amongst you. So the Eibishter says, you serve him, he's going to give you parnasa, and he's going to take away illness. And the next pasuk says, Leisihia mishakela. There will not be a woman who never aborts, who loses her fetuses, who loses her pregnancies. V'akara, nor God forbid, a barren woman, a woman who doesn't conceive. Ve'artecha, in your holy land. And then it says, Es mispar yamecha amale. The numbers of your days I will complete. So of course it's indicated in many sfarim that this is an emes for what we call Baneh Chaye U'Mezeineh. People have many needs, multiple needs, innumerable needs. But the core needs, the fundamental, the absolute, the unchanging, the constant needs of a human being go under three categories: children, health, and livelihood. The Torah here lists these three, but in a different order: livelihood, children, and longevity. Okay, livelihood and health, children, and longevity. Longevity means that people are going to live a long life. And it's understood that in these two psukim, the Eibishter says, you do what I want, and I'm going to provide you with bana chayim mezena, with panasa, with children, and with health and long life. This is the pshat in the Possuk. Now notice, I didn't read any of the commentaries. I just read the Possuk for you, the pashtus. So if you take this Possuk for face value, the Torah says, if and when you serve the Eibishter, so then there's going to be a berech aslachim basmimecha, leithia meshakela v'akora ba'atzecha, es mispa yamecha amalei, the Eibishter is going to provide you with bana chayim mezena. Right? Ask me a question. Turn to page 4. I'm sorry that my Gemara is such a mess, okay? I don't have a Gemara which is small enough to fit in my copy machine that's not scribbled. Okay? Amar Rava, the Gemara said, this is a whole story, a whole Gemara from Masechta Meid Cotton. Meid Cotton is not a happy Masechta. The second half of Meid Cotton talks about death. So the Gemara discusses all kinds of people and their tzaras. Amar Rava says, Chaye boneu mezena, health, children, and life, and panasa. Leibes chusa talya milsa has nothing to do with one's merits, one's earning. Ella b'mazla talya milsa, it has to do with mazel. Now, if you translate the word mazel as it's translated in the street, uselessly and incorrectly, mazel means fortune, it means luck. So the Gemara says that the three most basic needs of a human being are random, they're arbitrary. It could be the biggest tzaddik and be poor. It can be the biggest Rosh and be blessed. And Tosfos brings a Gemara about Rabbi Elazar ben Pedos. It's a really strange Gemara. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedos was incredibly poor, and he came to the Eibishter and said that Mosach kenish to halten. So the Eibishter says to Rabbi Elazar, I'll tell you what I'll do. Rabbi Elazar ben Pedos, did a deal. I'll destroy my world. I'll start over again from Bereshis, from Adam and Chava, and from Cain and Hevel, and from Enesh and so on. And maybe when I'll get to you the next time, perhaps you'll be born in a mazel of mezenis. Perhaps if I'll do it all again, you'll have a better mazel, and you'll be born in a time when you're supposed to have panos. Which is a strange Gemara. The Eibush is saying, Elazar ben Pedos, I'm sorry, I can't help you. Elazar ben Pedos was a great man. He was so poor. So he said, okay, you know what, I'll suffer, don't destroy your world. Let's not do another experiment. I don't think next experiment is better than the first. It's a strange Gemara. But it brings out the point that bana chayim mezena, the most basic needs of a person, are tali b'mazel. Right? So Tosfos brings right away on the page, if you look on Tosfos, right below the arrow on the left, Ela b'mazel talya v'hikshu b'Tosfos, ha'da'amorim b'seif Shabbos ein mazel Yisrael. Isn't it true Yidden have no mazel? How could we say that bana chayim mezena is b'mazel talya, that panasa, health and children, has with mazel, with fortune, with chance? The Gemara says Yidden have no mazel. And Tosfos answers, v'yesh leimed l'pamim mishtana yidei mazel. It can be changed to the mazel. Gihanu the Hashem, like the examples that are brought on Shabbos. Sometimes you can change your mazel, sometimes you cannot change your mazel. So a Yidden mazel is a little bit yeah and a little bit no. And of course in Chassidus doesn't read it Ein mazel Yisrael. Chassidus reads it Ayin mazel Yisrael. That the mazel of Yidden is the madrega of Ayin, and saying that the mazel of Yidden is the madrega of mazel is saying that Yidden have no mazel, because the madrega of Ayin there's no limit. What does mazel mean? Mazel means already written in the heavenly cards what you're going to get. What your fortune is going to be, you can't you can't fix it, you can't change it. Ayin mazel Yisrael, yeah, it's already written in the charts that by a Yid, the madrega of his source is Ayin, of Mela could always be changed. But this is an obvious question. It's a very blatant and obvious and plain question. How could you say Ein mazel Yisrael when it's a Possuk in Chumash? How could Rava make a statement in the Gemara that Bana Chayim Mezainu or Chayim Mezainu Bana is connected to Mazel when the Possuk says Va'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem, if you will serve the Eibishter Uveirach es lachmo es meimecha Va'aseresi machlem mikibecha Lesiyim et shkele b'kara b'atzecha and as the Mispah Yemecha Amali. It doesn't jibe. In other words, you have a kasha on the Gemara. How could the Gemara say that these things are connected to Mazel when the Torah says explicitly that you earn them through your good deeds? You understand the question? So there's many answers to this question. The Rabbeinu Bachaya begins to answer the question on page 5. This is further enhanced by the Panim Yafis, which is on page 10. What the Rabbeinu Bachaya says basically is like this. He brings, this is Pashas Vayelech, it's not even our Parsha. That it says in the Possuk, Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Hein korbu yamecha lamus. Your days are nearing for you to die. Hashem comes to Moshe Rabbeinu and says, your days are nearing for you to die. That doesn't sound like a good omen. Your days are nearing to die. So the Rebbe Bachaya translates, what does it mean your days are nearing to die? You have lived your fill. The Eibishter gives a person a certain number of years. And unfortunately, sometimes people are not zoicha to live as long as they're supposed to for various different reasons. So Hashem says to Moshe Rabbeinu, Hein, in your case, karvu yamecha lamus. You've lived your full life, and your days are nearing for the inyan feipachachayim, the inyan amisa, because you've lived your full life, which again implies two things: A, that's predetermined how long a person is going to live. It's not up to you and your actions. The Eibush has already decided that Moshe Rabbeinu is going to reach a certain age, and it's going to be karvu yamav lamus. But at the same time, it's implicit also in those words that it's possible that you shouldn't be zayche to live that long. Karvu yamecha lamus means you are finishing your allotment, you are finishing your quota of years. So it's mashma that it could be otherwise. So the Rebbe Bachaya uses this opportunity to go into this Gemara. If you look at the Gemara, the page 5 on the right side, the second line from the bottom, in this scheme about whether a person's years are fixed or variable, he says, "Ubefeidish amru b'me'et cotton b'seif perik el magalchen bon chayu mazeina labes chusatal yemilsa b'mazatayimos." That children, health, and parnasa are not dependent upon a person's chus; it's dependent upon mazel. So the Rebbe Bachaya explains. Listen to me. There are patterns to God's world, but God is in charge. They're both true. There are patterns to God's world means, yes, there are certain things that are determined, fixed. So a person is supposed to live so many years, a person is supposed to have so much wealth, a person is supposed to have so many children, or God forbid, a person is not supposed to have whatever it is. There are patterns to the Eibishter's world. But the patterns in the Eibishter's world are not such that the Eibishter is out of control. Because if you say that the patterns in the Eibishter's world render the Eibishter out of control, that means that the Eibishter is not in charge of his world, which would go to a core issue of faith. So therefore it says, yes, it's true there are patterns, and when the Eibishter wishes, he can manipulate them. Sometimes the Eibishter can take away from what he's given you. Like he brings one of the kings named Achazyahu, Bnei Shel Achav, died before his time. Sometimes a person has his years extended, and he gives the example from Chizkiyahu HaMelech, the Eibishter gave him 15 more years. And sometimes the Eibishter leaves it the way he originally planned it, like the example from this Pasha Chumash from Moshe Rabbeinu. And the Rabbeinu Bachaya explains, and if you look on the left side of page 5, the first of my 2 arrows, I'm sorry, the second of my 3 arrows. Right, there's an arrow at the top, there's an arrow in the middle, and there's an arrow closer to the bottom. Ve'im kain, biyur hamaymer. The way to explain this Gemara that says, Bona chayim mezein labesos tal yemilsa, ela b'mazal tal yemilsa. Hu shabal lahidiyenu, it's coming to teach us not that Hashem has no control, but rather, kama godul keach hatfila. How powerful is the power of prayer. It's exactly the opposite. The Eibishter fixes things, and he says it's up to Basel, I don't mix in. It's not. I'm not going to change my mind. And Afa Pikain, the Keach HaTfilah of a Yid, can override it. Okay, Hashem is above everything, and certainly He can do whatever He wants. Okay, and if the Eibishter wants, Hashem could change anything that the Eibishter planned. Okay, now go down 4 lines. There's a T in the middle of the text. All other things that the Eibush has determined to happen up to a person, based on the pattern and the plan that the Eibush fixes in this world. A Jew can change and improve his lot without davening, or without shouting to the Eibush, but by worrying and feeling bad in his heart. If you're a good guy and you want something, the Eibush will give it to you. But if it's not right, if you want something from the Eibush which is outside of children, health, and panasa, and I'm not sure exactly what that would be, but maybe wisdom. If you wanted something and you didn't have it, and it's not written in your, so to speak, proverbial subliminal celestial cards, so you're supposed to get this. If you want it, the Eibush will give it to you. Simply wanting is not enough. You got to pray. I'm reading now the 3rd arrow. These 3 things. You have to pray. And conventional prayer is not enough. You need to shout. Hashem gives us what we want. But when we cry, He saves us in these 3 areas of Bona Chayu Mezeina. And when a Yid davens and shouts, they're going to be given to him. And he gives you an example of all 3. Who davened for children and got them? Rachel. Who davened for longevity and got it? Chizkiyahu HaMelech, and who davened for parnasa, for food? Eliyahu HaNavi. So the Rebbe Bechaya says, that the Gemara says, Hashem fixes it, but that doesn't mean it's impossible to change. It just means it's very difficult. And to change it, you have to daven. And that's the remez in the words, Va'avadtem es Hashem Elokeichem. Va'avadtem Elokeichem doesn't mean you should serve God, that means you should daven. It's an interesting thing that the Rambam, when the Rambam brings the mitzvah of davening, he brings 2 psukim. First a Possuk from our Parsha, and then a Possuk from Shema. Va'avadtem es Hashem Elokeichem is the Rambam's first mocker for davening. Because the way we are now learning, Va'avadtem doesn't mean serve Hashem across the board. So you should have Bona Chayu Mezeina. Va'avadtem means to pray. Because prayer has a unique quality, that even these 3 things, that the Gemara said that Toli and Mazel, a Yid can overturn them to the Keach HaTfilah, because the Keach HaTfilah is very strong. Now if I may add another little nuance to this. There's discussions of this in many places. The Rebbe has this in the Chana Sicha that the Rebbe spoke in This is a topic which is quite frequent in the Rebbe's talks. You have it also on Chassidus before the Rebbe. The same idea. There's normal prayer and there's extraordinary prayer. Normal prayer means to talk to the Eibishter with reason, like a person talks to a person. I believe, and I have quite some indications for this from later parts of this stack, that the davening being described here, which can overrule mazel, which is so strong that even though the Eibishter fixes a person's parnasa and health and children before creation, and it's fixed in the mazalas, has to come from this very special kind of prayer, of whom an example is Chana. That Chana is accused, as you know the story in Tanakh. Chana is accused of being drunk, right? Eli calls her a shikir, and she says, Lo yadaini, I'm not shikir, but rather, Isha kshas ruach anoichi, I am bitter, I'm in a lot of pain. Va'esh beches nafshi lifnei havaya, I'm pouring out my soul, I'm pouring out my heart before the Eibishter. So when a person davens on a level which is called Hishtapchus HaNefesh, which is a very pneumistic prayer, it's considered a prayer which is like the Alter brings it in Love Mashchot Piyetz Chaim in the end of Tanya, that it makes a shinui in Gashmius to Mivarach Hashonim and made it Ageshem, that it physically changes the world. This is a prayer which comes from the very depths of a person, and therefore it's able to overturn a situation which was fixed by the Kvayach, by the Mazel, but the Eibush determines for a person. So to summarize, the Torah says, if you will serve me, you're going to get Parnasa, Gesund, and Nachas. And we asked the question from the Gemara, and the answer from the Bnei Bechaya is that normally you cannot change it, but davening has that power. Now, I want you to turn to the Alshich, which is on page 9. The Alshich has a different spin. The Alshich has a different spin, and to be sure, the Alshich is a bit problematic. You read the Alshich and you say, what? You're not sure. The Alshich has the same question we just asked. The question is, how do you reconcile the Possuk which says, "Va'avadtem es Hashem Elokechem," if you serve the Eibishter, "Uveirech es lachem v'smimecha," with the fact that the Gemara says that Bona Chayim Zayin is totally in Mazel. So he says a very simple word. The Alshich says, it doesn't say in the Torah, "Uverachecha belechem u'b'mayim." He's going to bless you with bread and water. He's going to bless your bread and your water. He translates, even if you're supposed to get a little bread and a little bit of water, the Eibishter could bless that little bread and that little water should be enough. So Bona Chayim Zayin b'mazle Taya says Alshich is true. Hashem cannot change your parnasa, but Hashem could change the efficiency of the use of it. So it's possible to have a lot and it should go to waste. And it's possible to have very, very little. The designated parnasa that the Eibush determined in the mazel should come to you in such an efficient way that he's not going to give you more bread, because he can't change that. But the bread which you're entitled to will be so blessed that it will be sufficient. So if you look inside on the second column, near the top, he's not saying that he's going to make you wealthy. I'm going to promise you that the little bit of bread that you do have and the little bit of water which you have been given will be blessed in your intestines. And you're not going to lack it. So the word is not that Hashem is going to give you more than the mazel. Hashem is going to make that what you're entitled to, you will get in such a way that it will be maximized. And then he also says that you'll be able to breathe bread and water and you won't get sick. So the first pasuk, where it says if you're going to serve the Eibishter, he translates, you cannot change the mazel. In other words, if your mazel is meager, if your mazel is diminished, all you're going to get is what's written in the mazel, but the Eibishter could make that it should be used properly. But when it comes to the next pasuk, he says exactly the opposite. He says the other way. He says the mazolos only bless, basically. Mazolos are like the heavenly forces, or laws of nature, if you will. The mazolos don't get into the particulars. So if a person has a mazel, it's invariable that some aspects of the mazel should not be perfect. For example, let's say there's a mazel that all the Yidden in a particular generation should have children. It's still conceivable that some shouldn't, because mazals are inexact. Let's say it's written in the mazals that every single Yid is supposed to have a long time, a long life. It's still conceivable that a few should not, because the mazals are inexact. So the Torah says, if you serve the Eibishter, there won't be a single infertile woman. As Mitzvah Yamacha Amali, no Jew will die young. In other words, it's the exact opposite. In the first part, the Alshich says Hashem can't change the parnasa, but He can maximize it. In the second part, he says the mazalos, even if the mazalos are blessing you with plenty, it's possible that the plenty shouldn't manifest with perfect efficiency. Even if Hashem is giving everybody children, one may end up without children. Even though Hashem is giving everybody long life, one may end up without long life. So the Eibishter says, I am going to override the tendency of the mazel to generalize and see to it that every single Jew, every single one should have children, and single one should have arichas yomim. Look at the next paragraph. Even if you're entitled to a blessing from the mazel, Hashem says, I'm going to exceed that bracha. The mazolis don't go into the particular aspects. Lasa is to a fact. Even if the mazel is supposed to see to it that we should all have children, it's possible that one or two should not. When you serve the Eibishter, says the Possuk, even an individual, a year, not a single one is going to be infertile. Okay? And if you'll skip down 2 lines, it's the same idea. So the Alshich takes this Possuk and splits it. The first half, the question is, how could you reconcile with so the first part of it, he says, you may be entitled to very little bread, and Eibush doesn't give you a bracha, that should be more than adequate. And the second part, even if the mazel is blessing you with kol tuv sela, when it manifests, it could be inexact. Says the Eibush that I will see to it that the bracha of the mazel will be perfect and whole and total. So the Alshich addresses the question of the stira between the Possuk and the Gemara differently than the Rabbeinu Bechaya. Rabbeinu Bechaya says that tefillah can override the mazel. And the Alshich says, no, tefillah cannot override the mazel, but the Eibishter can either perfect what the mazel provides or actually exceed what the mazel is providing. So it's not changing the mazel, it's either using it to maximum efficiency or achieving even a greater meta perfection, and the mazel itself facilitates, permits. Now we don't have time, we really don't have time, but on page 10 there is a Padam Yafis who also the Padam Yafis says the same thing as the Rabbeinu Bechaya, that tefillah can compensate for, I'm not going to read it inside, tefillah can compensate for the mazel, even though the Eibush already fixes the mazals, davening could change it, the Rabbeinu Bechaya says, but in the second paragraph it says the Pashta Zach, tshuva can change it. He says, what is the reason we're fixed with the mazalos? Because of Adam and Chava. So what we need to do to override the constraints that were put on us with Adam and Chava is tshuva. And when a yid does tshuva, he's no longer bound by the mazalos. The idea that we're bound by the mazalos has to do with the original sin. And when we do tshuva, which in practical terms means, when we engage in Avedas Habirurim, when we correct the results of the sin of Adam and Chava, we can exceed their own mazel, and that's the pshat of Avatem es Hashem Elokeich. Okay? This is the Padam Yafis. You know what the Padam Yafis was? The Alter Rebbe, one of the Alter Rebbe's Chavedim, the Pinchas of Frankfurt. Okay. So, we learned a Possuk that gave us a simple pshat, which is self-explanatory. That said, if you will serve Hashem, you're going to have health, wealth, and children. We asked a question from a Gemara, and we answered it from a Rabbeinu Bechaya and from an Alshich, and we also mentioned the Padam Yafis. Okay? Now the next item on our agenda is the Ramban. The Ramban is on the first page. And the Ramban is elementary. The Ramban is very basic. Okay, and we're going to read it. The Ramban is important. It's basic, but it's important. The Ramban is unique because the Ramban explains these psukim in context. You see, this is Pasuk Chav Hey and Chavov, right? Beginning with Pasuk Chav, 5 psukim before, he begins to discuss the idea that Hashem is going to send a malach to take us into Eretz Yisrael, and he's going to punish the Canaanites, and it's all going to be wonderful. But he warns us, don't become a pagan yourself. Don't get caught up in the pagan and the Avodah Zarah worships. So the Ramban says, it's on page 1 on the left, on the right, at the bottom. A yid should serve the Eibishter, and the Eibishter is going to bless your bread. The meaning of this pasuk is simply as follows. Because most pagans, most idolaters, recognize and they know Ki Hashem anichba, the honorable God, who is the God of God and Master of Masters. In other words, most idolaters are not atheists. An atheist and a pagan is a very different thing. An atheist doesn't believe in one God. The pagans believed in the concept of a monotheist, of one God. But they believed, as the Rambam describes it, that Cholak Hashem Kavod, the Eibishter creates his world using different forces. And we should appeal not just to the creator of those forces, but to the individual forces themselves. In other words, the pagans believed that the Eibishter created different forces to govern his world, and that those forces have free will. And since those forces have free will, they should be honored. So idolatry isn't saying there isn't one God. Idolatry is saying there's one God with a capital G, and a bunch of gods with small g's. And let's worship them also because they provide parnasa and health and wealth. Says the Torah, don't get caught up in these secondary gods. And to be very, very practical, I mean, what's the classic name of of God in America? He carries his name around proudly. In God we trust. The dollar bill. I once heard the Rebbe say very emotionally, Geld in America is Egel Azov. But the Rebbe blurted it out, he shouted it. Money in America is the golden calf. And boy, is it ever. The Alter Rebbe is quoted as having said once, that the Gemara says, that the times of the Anshkas Agdoila, the Chachamim saw that idol worship was so pervasive, was so strong, that it was impossible for people to overcome the temptation. We look at idolaters today and think they're fools. But in the ancient world, idolatry was an incredible temptation. So the Gemara says they removed it. They took away the temptation for idol worship. They took away the temptation for idol worship. So the Alter Rebbe commented, they took away the temptation for idol worship, they had to put it somewhere. There's a loose temptation. There's a free radical. There's a klipa force for temptations connected to the worldly things, which doesn't have a base. So they put it into money, guilt. And then the Alter Rebbe added in Yiddish, "Ich weiß nicht, ob es hat sich gelohnt." I'm not sure it was a good deal. In other words, perhaps we were better off with idolatry as the temptation than money, which is the modern idol. But the Ramban is saying people had a tendency to say, let me worship the hand that is feeding me, rather than this that the hand is connected to. And therefore they worship many gods. Says the Ramban, don't do that. I'll read from the beginning again. The meaning of this Possuk. Ba'avur, to be sure, even most pagans, Yakiru recognize and knew. Ki Hashem that the honorable God who is the God of gods and the Master of masters. In other words, they believed in monotheism. When they worshipped idols, it was rak yachshavu. They were thinking, they thought that worshipping the intermediate gods will bring them material success. They should worship the sun, because the sun, of course, provides panasa through photosynthesis, and the moon, which has to do with bringing up the upswelling of the wells, and so forth and so on. Okay? The Alkain, 3 lines from the bottom. So they worshipped other gods, not in the belief that they were almighty, but in the belief that the Almighty created them as intermediate forces. And by worshipping these intermediate forces, it would benefit their lives. The Alkain, Yemer HaKosav Hazeh, says the Torah, Ki ba'avedas HaKadosh Baruch Hu Bilvad, when you serve Hashem alone, if you serve Hashem and forget the sun and the moon and the stars and the angels, you'll have success and you'll be protected. Removing idol worship will not punish you. It's going to give you all kinds of abundance and all kinds of blessings and all kinds of good things. Now I would suggest, and this is a bit pretentious, the Ramban is saying that Bona Chayu Mezeineh B'maz L'Talyeh is, so to speak, an in-between state. What does idol worship say? Idol worship says God created the world, but He runs His world through intermediates, through Mimutzayim. And since God created His world and He runs His world through intermediates, in the words of the Rambam, as God honors those intermediates, we should honor them as well. Okay? So, the Gemara, so there's 3 possibilities. Number 1, Hashem created intermediates, and I'm going to honor them. Number 2, Hashem created intermediates, and I'm not going to honor them, but I'm not going to honor God either. And number 3, I'm not going to honor the intermediates, and I will honor God. And I believe, perhaps, this is what the Ramban is hinting to. The Gemara says, children health panasa. To worship other gods is a waste of time. But it is true that in the mazolis, that means to say in the forces of nature that the Eibush created, these things are fixed. And the Torah says, that when you serve Hashem, you can change that. You can add additional bracha to it. So, this is just a suggestion. Means that the Eibishter did create these intermediate forces, and they do determine how much you're going to get. it's foolish to worship them because they have no free will, but they exist. So the first of all, the Torah says, don't be a fool and worship the intermediates, they have no power. But then there's something more. Don't feel contained by these intermediates. Don't feel like, yeah, well, they already decide how much money I'm going to have. It's a waste of time for me to do anything. First of all, don't worship idols. And second of all, do worship God. Because when you do worship God, you can actually change the mazalos. You can change the forces of nature, the forces of heaven that the Eibishter predicts or predetermines to the basis of people's panos. So the Ramban is therefore saying that Hashem Elokecha means worship God and don't worship idols. And I'm suggesting that bedakas, that's the pshat b'mazla tali. This is the first idea in the Ramban. Now the Ramban is quite long, and you'll notice that I actually struggled myself through a huge Even Ezra before I decided against teaching it to you. That's the advantage of being a student. But I want you to turn to page 2. And I just want to show you the very last words of the Ramban. And these last words of the Ramban open up the window that will eventually become the Kabbalah and the Hasidus of this Shir. You see my arrow on the left? V'hatam v'avadatem es Hashem Elokecha rikein ha'avoda l'shem ha'miyuchad. The meaning of the word, you should serve God, means rikin. You should focus all of your service on Shem ha'miyuchad, on the pure name of God, and the ideal name of God, which is Hashem. In other words, not only should you not worship idols, you shouldn't even talk to Shem Elokim and Shem Tzvakas and Shem Adnai. You should talk to Shem Havaya. To use practical terms, Shem Havaya is the lakus, which is Lamayla Miderach Hatem. But then it says V'Omeru Beirach, and He will bless, V'Hasiroisi, and I will remove. You see the conflict? He will bless and I will remove. He is third person, and I is first person. Now, in the Torah, everything is perfect. And when you read two psukim and the Torah bounces around between first person and third person, you have a problem. If you look at these two psukim, the Torah changes. Right? You should serve the Eibishter. Uveirach, and He will bless. As lachmecha v'esmeimecha, your bread and your water. V'asiroisi, I will remove. As the machmekabach. There will not be any barren women in the land. Then it says, I will fill up your days. So the Torah bounces around between first person and third person, and the Rabban wonders why. The Torah should either be written in one syntax or the other, not both. The Torah, Moshe should be speaking to the Yidden about Hashem in third person. Hashem says, if you worship Him, He will bless you. Or Hashem says, if you worship me, I will bless you. What's the significance of Him and I in the same sequence? So the Ramban answers in typical Ramban fashion. Kederach ki ani Hashem reifecha. Like it says, I am Hashem reifecha. How do you translate that? What's the problem with those words? Ani Hashem reifecha. When was the last time you said, I, Yossi Paltiel, wish you a good morning? That's not normal, right? I heal you. Not I am God will heal you. I, Hashem, doesn't make any sense. It's not just redundant, it's two layers, two levels. I means Hashem is speaking in first person. Hashem means Moshe is talking about Him. No human being, no anything, describes himself by his own name unless he's so conceited that it's terrible. So Ani Havaya means Hashem is saying I, and Moshe is adding, that means Hashem Reifecha. So the Ramban says, if you want to know why we're bouncing around between first person and third person here, look what I wrote in Pashas B'Shalach on the Possuk, Ani Hashem Reifecha. And to be sure, I looked it up. And I didn't find it in the Ramban. I didn't look very hard, but the Ramban apparently is written in typical, succinct fashion. But if you turn to page 8, you'll find your answer. This is the Rikanti. The Menachem Rikanti was one of the great Kabbalists of old. He lived about 700 years ago. He goes back to the way before the Arizal. And he says, you see page 8? Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem uveidach es lachmecha v'goymer. Kosav HaRamban Zal, the Ramban writes, Inyan HaKosav b'shtei l'shenis. The fact that the Torah is written in two syntax, first person and third person. First it says uveidach, he will bless. Then it says v'asiroi si, I will remove. V'hamaskel yivinu mi Possuk ani Hashem lefecha. The answer is v'yesh lefarish kavanasei. We could interpret his intent b'shnei panim in two ways. When Hashem says I and he, they're both true. There's a level of godliness which is referred to as him, and there's a level of godliness which is referred to as I. And the Ramban gives us two ways of looking at it. The first way is Ka'ashchina medaberes, that the lower level of godliness, which is called Shechina, speaks in first person. V'oimeres, and is saying Sheyavdu as Hashem HaGadol, should serve Havaya, the great name, which is the higher level of godliness. Zah. V'hu yizbarach, and then he, the Eibishter, yivarech es lachmecha lachmeinu v'esmeinu, will bless our bread and our water. Ki mimenu abracha ba'al el, the blessing to the world comes from Shem Havaya. Umilas v'asiresi medaber al Shechina. And the lower level says, and I'm going to remove the obstacles. Ki hi amar pas, and he'll shenem machatzti v'niyerpa v'zed nira li noch. Havaya, Yud-Kei Vav-Kei, is Ein Sof. Right? We all call it Kutcha Bricha. Shechina goes on the level of godliness, which we call Malchus, which is much closer to the creation. It's much more contained. So Shechina says to Yidden, serve Hashem. Serve the Eibishter who's Ein Sof. Because all brachas come from him. And he will bless you. And I, says the Shechina, will remove the obstacles. You should serve Ein Sof. And Ein Sof will bless you. And I'm going to remove any obstacles that may arise between you and the Ein Sof. You know what it's like? There's Isaiah, which is also mentioned in Kutas Maimer Tes. Of course, you're going to read it, the 9th Maimer. And the Isaiah describes the wheel of fortune. What's the source of the wheel of fortune? The Isaiah. And it's taka connected to Parnasa, amongst other things. He says there's a stikla, there's tachras kamei, there's a wheel that spins. When the wheel spins to the right, it gives you blessing, and the wheel spins to the left, it gives you the opposite of blessing. But the Zayed observes, when a wheel turns, nothing happens, unless there's something that goes into the wheel. So the Parnasa comes from the Eibishter. The way the wheel spins determines how the Parnasa comes to you. So the Parnasa is not the wheel, the Parnasa is Havaya, a higher inyan. But if the tikla, the stachras kamei, the wheel of fortune is spinning to the left, that same Parnasa will be wasted. And if the wheel is spinning to the right, the very meager Parnasa may become incredibly efficient and sufficient. So the Rikanti's first pshat is that Shechina says, blessings come from the Eibishter. I'll steer him in a useful direction. And therefore the third person is a reference to the higher Madrege, and the first person is a reference to the lower Madrege. This is how it is in the early Yom Kabbalah. Chassidus is going to say precisely the opposite and base attack on that Ramban himself and his Akdama to Chumash. Omnam yesh mefash is the second interpretation. That when it's speaking in first person, that's the higher level. That's Ein Sof, Yizbarach. And the lower level, Shechina, is spoken of in third person. Okay? Ubeirach, Shechina is going to give a bracha. Shechina gives a blessing to the world. And Havai, he says, I'm going to remove all ailment. Sweetens dinim. The second pshat is exactly the opposite. That the first person is the higher level. The third person is the lower level. Moshe says to Yidden, you know that your connection to the Eibishter is through Shechina. So serve the Eibishter, so Shechina will bless you, and I will sweeten whatever judgment Shechina gives. In other words, that Shem Havaya, which is higher than Shechina, is spoken of in first person. Be that as it may, we have now entered the world of the Kabbalah, which is analyzing this Possuk, and not simply translating the word from Avadatem as Hashem Elokeichem, but it's analyzing the subtlety, the nuance, why you start off in third person and then you go to first person. And the Rikanti says one is a lower level, the other is a higher level, or one is a higher level, the other is a lower level. Now we get to the Maimer Chasidus, which begins on page 11. Now I want you to know that I skipped a number of important inyanim that I prepared to teach you. I skipped an al-bag, but there's not enough time to do everything. The Maimah you have in front of you is one of the most famous Maimodim of our Rebbe. It's from 1952. This is the famous Leisiyah Mishakela. It's a very, very famous Maimah. There's a lot of stories that revolve around this Maimah and so forth. This Maimah was said approximately 1 month after the Rebbe, 1 year after the Rebbe became Rebbe. And the way I understand it, this is my own personal opinion, after 1 year being Rebbe, the Rebbe made a discovery. And the discovery was that his life, as he knew it, as a private person, is fini. And in this Maimah, he speaks very emotionally about this idea. Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai says, there's no time left for me to think about myself. The story goes, I wasn't born in 1952, that the Rebbe cried so much, he pushed it, in the middle of the Maimah, put his head down on the table, the big lady cup. It's at the end of the Maimah, but that's not the part we're going to learn, of course. We're going to learn the philosophy, but the Maimah got very emotional. The Rebbe talked about the idea of completely forgetting. He says how even Yiras Hashem and Avas Hashem could still be ego, complete bittul. And he finished the Maimah with this Rabbi Yochanan ben Zakkai, that a person totally sacrifices himself on the altar of public service. He lays on his deathbed and he says, I don't know if I've done my job. Because he's been so busy doing what needed to get done, he doesn't know if he did what it was that the Eibishter created him for. Yeah, this is the Maimah, the way I see it personally. This was 1 year after the Rebbe became Rebbe. It's the first Shabbos Mevorchim after the second Yud Shvat. It's a very emotional, it's a very powerful story. There's much record of it, and it's very emotional and so forth. But in addition to being a Maimah with a lot of history and a lot of emotional meaning, it's also a very beautiful Maimah as a piece of scholarship, as a piece of philosophy. And the body of the Maimah revolves around the same question. What is the meaning of the words of Avadatem as Hashem Elokeichem, serving the Eibishter? Part of the issue, though by no means all of the issue, part of the issue is the question we asked at the beginning. Can a person affect what kind of parnasa they're going to have? Or can a person not affect what kind of parnasa they're going to have? That's the question. Because the Gemara says you cannot affect it, and the Possuk seems to be saying you can affect it. And of course the Maimah gives a different answer. The Maimah's answer is going to be, it depends what level. On a lower level you could affect parnasa, on a higher level you cannot affect parnasa, and perhaps on an even higher level you could again affect parnasa. But the Maimah explains the Possuk V'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem, and introduces us to Rabbi Sai, what is considered one of the classic Kabbalistic ideas. The source, this is an Avodas HaKodesh. I originally thought about copying the Avodas HaKodesh. I took it out and I realized that it's a book. I'm not going to copy a whole book. So I closed the Avodas HaKodesh and put it back on my shelf. But what I'm about to share with you is truly one of the cornerstones of Chochmas HaKabbalah. And I talk about this all the time. If you come to my classes, you've heard this before. But this is where it's discussed in Hasidus. This Maimah from the Leisiyah Mishakela is based on Hemshech Hayim Beis. If you look on I made sure to copy the page number on the left side of page 165. It's also based on Hemshech HaTeres. It goes all the way back to the Alter Rebbe. This is a Maimah which every one of the Rabbeim repeated. The source of this discourse is the Avodas HaKodesh, and the emes is that there's a Ramban in Sot Pashas Tetzaveh which says the same thing. And the Kabbalistic question, or the question is Avodah Tzorach Gavoya question mark, or Avodah Tzorach Gavoya period or exclamation point. We know that in Jewish theology there are many points of view. There are many shittas. In general, however, all of Jewish theology conforms to one of two categories. There's two basic types of theology: philosophy and mysticism, non-Kabbalah and yes Kabbalah. And the differences between non-Kabbalah and yes Kabbalah are numerous. And this is one of the classic differences. The question is, who benefits from Yiddishkeit? And the philosophers say very plainly, only man. God has nothing from it. Why did Hashem create the world? Hashem is nice. He wants to give us an opportunity. But to say that God benefits from His creation, and that there's truly a concept of nachas ruach lefanei shamatim nasar eteinei, is childish. This is a logical, it's a philosophical position that says, you telling me God cares? It's all for us. So this point of view, this shita will say, avodah tzorech gavoya? Question mark. Serving God is going to benefit on high, is going to benefit God. That's foolish. Therefore, when you ask the philosophers, taimei ha-mitzvahs, when you ask the philosophers for the reasons for the mitzvahs, they go on the two basic categories as the Rambam describes them in the Nevuchim Chelik Gimel. Either to improve character of a person, to refine a person's character, or to develop the person's mind, to refine the human intellect so we can closer to the Eibishter. But the notion that God cares about our mitzvahs seems to the philosophers to be foolish. Then comes Kabbalah. And of course Kabbalah adds to the reality of creation and the relationship between creator and creation what we call ma'atil and netzal, godliness, elokus. And Kabbalah says avodah tzorech gavoya, period. Not question mark. Avoid, when we serve God, tzorech gavoya, it benefits Hashem. Yeah, but how could you say it benefits Hashem? Does Hashem really care? What difference does it make to God? And so forth and so on. And the answer, Rabbi Isai, is the Yiddishkeit we do cannot benefit what we call atzmus. The Eibishter himself doesn't benefit from Atayda mitzvahs, at least not in the initial position. But Hishtalshalos does. Godliness. When the Eibishter created Seder Hishtalshalos, Oida Laki, and the levels of godliness, we say when we do Atayda mitzvahs, it benefits Alakus. One simple example for this would be this question. Everybody here is a mother. Many of you are mothers, and you've had bar mitzvahs. So you learned this idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu maniach tefillin. The mitzvah Maimon talks about Hashem puts on tefillin. This is one of the clear differences between Kabbalah and Chakirah. In philosophy, Hashem putting on tefillin doesn't mean that at all, because Hashem doesn't do mitzvahs. That's foolish. But in Kabbalah, it means Hashem puts on tefillin. Where? In Atzilus. Then when you put on tefillin, the keli of Atzilus, the Eved and Atzilus, which corresponds to the mitzvah of tefillin, is triggered. Your mitzvahs affect on high. The Eibush does mitzvahs reciprocally, but our mitzvahs are to raise up from the lower levels to the higher levels, and the Eibush's mitzvahs are to bring down from the higher levels to the lower levels. So the pshat means that a yid kalayachol is benefiting the Eibushter. And I want to show you the words. He begins on top of page 165, which is the left side of your page. The idea of serving God needs to be questioned. Everybody understands what it means that a servant serves his master. Why do people need slaves and servants? Although he's a master, everybody knows that masters lack certain things. That's why masters have servants. The servant serves his master to satisfy his lacks, to fulfill his wants. Right? Go down 2 lines, end of the line where the vertical line is aval. However, lamaila, when you talk about God, translates the Rebbe, be the servant of God. Means to be the servant of God means that you somehow make God whole. That's foolish. The Hashem is perfect and whole. Any move when it doesn't make any sense. How could you explain that a Jew serves the Eibishter? In other words, how could we say that I am God's servant and I am going to correct him and I am going to perfect him and I am going to add to him? Isn't Hashem perfect? That's the question. Okay? So the first point that the Maimer makes, that the meaning of the word avodah means you are Hashem's servant and you are being mashlim him, you are making him whole. And therefore the Maimer says, how could you make God whole? And the answer is Yiddishkeit matters to God. Look at the next paragraph. V'hinei mavur al zeh b'chasidus. Chasidus explains. Shezeh tolei be'ezeh madrega shemadaber. It depends on the level. V'hinei b'madregas aden yachad she'eleh shashar roshim. These are words from the Sefer Avodas HaKodesh. On the level which is called the Eibishter himself, or in Kabbalah language, Atik. Shulamayla me'eshtalshus, which goes beyond any limitations. Hinei sham ein negei Avodah shalamata. What we do doesn't matter at all. Aval, however, bebechina on this level of ishtalshelus, shetzarach liyachad shama reish v'aseif shabah. In other words, when we talk about atzilus, where there's levels and there's godliness coming into vessels, hinei sham negei inyan avodah. Yid's worship matters. So Kabbalah says avodah tzorach kavaya. When a Yid serves Hashem, it's not just benefiting himself; it's benefiting the Eibishter as well. And the source of this Kabbalistic idea is our Possuk. What's Kabbalah's proof that Judaism matters to God? What's the diuk? I mean, be God's servant, which is interpreted to mean you make God whole. And the question becomes, how could you make God whole? God is already perfect, and this becomes proof for this idea of tzorach kavaya. So this Possuk in our parsha becomes the basis for one of the core separations between Kabbalah and Chakira. Non-Kabbalistic theology versus Kabbalistic theology. The Kabbalah talks about Hishtalshelus, Elokus, in Giluyim, Oidus, and Kalim, and we say, when we do Teirah, Mitzvahs, Kvayachol, what the Kabbalah would say, L'shem, Yichud, Kodesh, Brichu, Shchinte. You create a union on high. None of this exists in philosophy. In other words, our mitzvahs trigger the Eibush doing mitzvahs, and we are creating the Eibush's mitzvahs. And in as much as this is concerned, Avodah tzorach kavaya. But the catch is, the Avodah tzorach kavaya is true in Ishtalshelus. It's true in Atzilus. Avodah tzorach kavaya is not true in Atzmus. Turn the page. On page 12 on the right side, the Rebbe on the right side of the page goes into a whole theology explaining to you how far a Jew's Avodah touches and how far a Jew's Avodah doesn't touch. I'm not going to read it with you, it's too much technical stuff, but the essence of what he says is a Yid's Avodah touches Kalim of Atzilus, then he says it touches the Eidos of Atzilus, and then it touches the Eidos which are higher than Atzilus that are later mislavish in Atzilus. The level that a Yid's Avodah does not touch is what he calls Atik Yomin. So all of a sudden this Possuk, V'avalatem es Hashem Elokeichem, becomes far more meaningful. It's no longer a question, the answer becomes automatic. On the Madrega of Ishtalshelus, where our Yiddishkeit matters, right? What does it say in the Possuk? You serve God and you're going to be rewarded. What's the pshat? You serve God, you're going to be rewarded. On that level, where your avodah kvayachol benefits the Eibishter, you're going to be rewarded. And when the Gemara says, La v'schusa talya milsa, that parnasa and health and children have to do with mazel, this is in the madrega where your avodah does not touch. So it automatically resolves this question about mazel and schus, because there's two madregas. And the Maimed teaches us, this is what I just taught you is not Chasidus. What I just taught you is Kabbalah. It's classic Kabbalah. And like I said, the source for this is a Riches Nifla and Sefer Avodas HaKodesh for Meir ben Gabbai. I tell you, I wanted to make copies. It's mamish a whole section. Kuntis Avodah, Sha'ar Avodah deals with this issue. That Kabbalah says what we do touches God. It matters. But explains that this doesn't mean the Eibishter. It means say the Ishtalshelus. So the Shir should end right here. No. Now we get to Chasidus. What we just learned was Chochmas HaKabbalah. Chasidus is something more. And the Rebbe has a number of different talks on this. And Chasidus says, Avodah tzorach kavaya, that when a Yid serves Hashem, it benefits on high, means Take, the Eibishter himself. God himself. Kabbalah says, Avodah tzorach kavaya, that the Yiddishkeit of a Yid can touch Elokus, godliness, Hishtalshelus. Chasidus says no. Avodah tzorach kavaya means a Yid can touch the Eibishter himself. Why? Because a Yid is a piece of Eibishter. A Yid is a shtick Eibishter. And he explains, Omnom b'emes, bottom of the right side on page 12. Ein zeh maspek adayim. What I said so far is not enough. Levayir Mashakosov, to explain the Possuk. Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem. That avoid the Tzorach Gavoya means Hishtalshalos. That a Yid's avoid that touches godliness in as much as it's limited to Atzilus. The Mashakosov Avadatem Koi Al Madeg is to say that Hishtalshalos. You must say that Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem means that a Yid to avoid it could not just touch say that Hishtalshalos, but a Yid could avoid it could touch Alakus Mamish, the Eibishter himself. And I want to use my own words here. This is the difference between Kabbalah and Hasidus. There's a very famous word from Alter Rebbe, where the Alter Rebbe was asked by one of his Hasidim that he should say Maimorim on Kabbalah, say Maimorim on Eitz Chaim. And he responded with these words: Was is Eitz Chaim Hishtalshalus? What does Kabbalah deal with? Hishtalshalus, levels. We, meaning Hasidus, speaks higher and higher. I know this sounds simplistic, but it's not. The difference between Kabbalah and Hasidus is Kabbalah talks about the lights of godliness. Hasidus talks about God himself. And Kabbalah says that a human being has within himself the representation of the various levels of godly lights, and therefore our actions can trigger those godly lights. Hasidus says a Yid is a chelik elakami mal mamish. A Yid is a piece of the Eibishter, and therefore the avoid of a Yid, Tzorach Gavoya, could touch the Eibishter himself. And the explanation is, it's in a different maimah, which I didn't copy for you. How does a Yid touch the Eibishter himself? Through tefillah. And like I told you in the very beginning of tonight's class, what does tefillah mean? Not conventional tefillah, but davening with Mesiras Nefesh. When a Yid davos a level of Mesiras Nefesh, like the story of Chana, Aveda Tzorach Gavoya, a Yid touches Atzmas himself, the Eibishter himself. And Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem doesn't only mean that the Yiddishkeit that we do can affect L'Shem Yichud Kutchabrichu Shchinta Yichud and Atzilus, as Kabbalah would explain it. But Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem, a Yid touches Atzmas himself. Where do you see it in the Possuk? Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem. Hashem says, Moshe says, you should be a servant of Havaya Elokeichem, which means you should complete Havaya and Elokim. Havaya Elokim is Hishtalshalus, names of the Eibishter. And then it says, Uveirach es lachem chaves mimach. The schar you're going to get for Va'avadatem es Hashem Elokeichem is that Havaya Elokim, Seder Hishtalshalus, is going to bless you with panos. What does it say after that? We shift from third person to first person. I will remove all ailment. I will see to it that nobody will be barren. I will see to it that everyone is going to live a long life. So the Rebbe says, who is I? I is Atzmas Ein Sof, the Eibishter himself. And he brings Taka the Ramban. The Ramban says in his introduction to Chumash, a few words. From these few words, Hasidus builds a castle, a city, a metropolis. The Ramban observes that the Torah is written in third person. It's a narrative, right? I'm not much of a writer, but some of you have taken a hack at writing, right? I'm sure one of you is a great writer, and many of us are wannabes, yeah? But when they teach you how to write, you have to choose. Are you going to write in first person or in third person? Are you going to tell a story as though you are the story, you are in the story, or are you going to describe? The worst thing anybody could do is jump back and forth, because then you're confused, right? So this is different styles. The Torah is written in third person. God said to Moses, Moses said to God, God said to the people. Who was telling us this story? Never identified. The Ramban actually asks, the Chumash should begin with the words, Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe Ksoiv. God said to Moshe, write, Bereshis bara Elokim. But it doesn't begin that way. It begins Stam, Bereshis bara Elokim. In the beginning, Elokim created heaven and earth. Says the Ramban, because there's a concept called Shlishi HaMedaber, the unidentified narrator. And Hasidus explains it very beautifully. The names of the Eibishter are never references to him. Hashem doesn't have a name. The names of the Eibishter are Kefei Ma'aseh Anenik, have to do with the Eibishter's function. The names of the Eibishter have to do with the Midas. When Hashem is doing Chesed, he's called Kael. When he's doing Racham, he's called Havaya, and so forth. The Eibishter himself is called, like we had in last week's Parsha, Anoichi. Hashem Alekechas Giluyim, Mishtalshalos. Anoichi is the Eibishter himself. So the Torah is a narrative between Havaya and Moshe. Hashem is speaking to Moshe, Shakai is speaking to Avraham, and so forth. Who is saying all this? The Eibishter himself. Atzmas Hus. But the narrator periodically appears on the scene. The narrator, who is in the background, every once in a while talks to you. The narrator is telling you about conversations between the Eibishter and Moshe, and every once in a while the narrator says, and I say. Because from time to time in the Chumash, the Eibishter himself makes an appearance. This is especially true in my view in Pashas Tetzaveh. V'ata Tetzaveh Bnei Yisrael. Hashem's name is never mentioned. You have a whole sequence of psukim where Hashem is talking to Moshe Rabbeinu in first person. V'niktash bechveidi. The Eibishter speaks to Moshe in first person. There's a whole shtur of mechsidus on those psukim in Pashas Tetzaveh. And that's what the Rebbe says here. The Possuk starts off in third person. V'avadetem es Hashem Elokeichem. You have to make a whole Hashem Elokim. Say the Nishtashlos. But then it says, "V'hasirei machla," I will remove. That the Yid's avodah is tzedek gavoya, touches on high, not just in the lakus, but avodah tzedek gavoya touches on high, touches Atzmas Ein Sof, touches the Eibishter himself. This is not Kabbalah. This is Chassidus. And he goes into it. The Rebbe explains all the nuances of the psukim on this basis. Okay, so you know what? Let's do it this way. Let's look on page 12, where I made my first arrow. And this is what the Possuk is saying. You should worship God. And remember, Vavadatem is you should be the servant of, which means you should make perfect and whole Havaya Lekim. The Shlishi Amadaber Eimer, the unidentified narrator is saying, the kasher v'avadatem es havaya lekechem, and you will worship Hashem Elokim, which goes in the lakus and ishtalshalos. Hini azu beirech es lachmocha v'esmei mecha. So then you will be blessed from havaya lekim. Dezeh koya lavaya. This is a reference to the idea that a Yid's Yiddishkeit touches Seder ishtalshalos. Shu yivarech es lachmocha v'esmei mecha. He'll bless your bread and water. Now, if the Torah would stop here, we would simply say that Banachayum is b'schus Talia is in ishtalshalos, and b'mazal Talia is l'mayla ishtalshalos. But then it continues. It doesn't say v'heser havaya or v'heser machal kabacha. I will remove ailment. All of a sudden, the Eibishter, the narrator who's in the background of the Torah, comes to the foreground, and Hashem talks to us directly. Atzmas Hus says, "Your Yiddishkeit has touched me, not just ishtalshalos, and therefore v'asiresi machal mikabecha." Shashlishi amadaber eimer loshen nechach shehu atzmai, the Eibishter himself, yaseh machla mikabecha, will remove all kinds of ailments from the Jewish people. Okay, and this is the vort. This is the vort. V'im kain, 4 lines from the bottom, please. 4 lines from the bottom. Im kain, move him his edge. Therefore understood. Although Kabbalah, although the Avodas HaKodesh will say that Avodas Hashem only touches Alakus and Ishtalshalos, and not what he called on the bottom of the previous page, Adein Yocha Chedesh HaSharashim, Chassidus disagrees and says no. A Yid not only touches a lakus, a Yid touches a lakah. Val a Yid is a chelik a lakah mimal mamish. She'inyan avodah negeh, when we serve Hashem, it touches gam lebchin shlishi amadaber shehu inyan ha'atzmos, the Eibishter himself. V'tzarach lahaven. Question is, eich bechinas avodah magas l'sham. How could a Jew touch atzmos? Isn't it true that the Eibishter doesn't care? Like the philosophers say, come on, avodah tzedek avaya. The Eibishter cares, and the Mekubalim say that he cares only in the ishtalshalos and not in atzmos. Right? But the answer is the particulars don't matter. The particulars of avodah don't matter. This doesn't touch the Eibishter. Aval, turn to page 13. However, the transformation of darkness into light. The fact that through Avodas Hashem we correct the Eibishter's world. The Brias and Berias Ba'alma Beri Pchusa. The Eibishter cares. What does the Eibishter care about? The Eibishter doesn't care about the great goodness we achieve in the world. The Eibishter cares about the struggle and the transformation of darkness into light. What touches the Eibishter is not the meaning in our Yiddishkeit, but the struggle and the victory against our struggles in our Yiddishkeit. What we call a Basi Lagani is Kafia Veshapcha. This touches Atzmus. Because when a Yid struggles in this world to serve the Eibishter, he gets to the very essence of himself and touches the very essence of the Eibishter. And this is the pshat in the Possuk. The question, of course, then becomes: so how do you deal with the mazel and the schus? And the answer is mazel is in between. Schus is a level lower, hishtalshelus. Schus is a level higher. Ein mazel Yisrael, ayin mazel Yisrael, atzmus, and in between you have the madrega of mazel. Anyway, we've done quite a bit tonight, and we'll call it a class.